Hello, everyone. Today, I'm very honored to have Milos Maricic with us. He's a global expert on artificial intelligence for finance and philanthropy. He's a published writer, renowned speaker. He teaches at the University of Geneva, and he's a polyglot who speaks 7 languages fluently. So, Milos, I have to ask you, are you just naturally talented when it comes to learning languages?
Your intro made me blush, Jennifer. Thank you very much for that. Talent has something to do with that, for sure, but it's not the full picture. And when I talk about that, I usually use the example of my German. It was the second foreign language that I started to learn 25, 30 years ago, and just because I never managed to find a real context for learning it, I never had the right approach. Over the years, it became my third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and now it's my seventh language, and I barely speak it fluently. So you would think that if I was just naturally a talent, a genius for languages, I would have picked it up sooner.
Well, to be honest, I think that makes me feel a little bit better. And I'm sure that makes my students feel a little bit better that even you struggle with learning languages as a polyglot. So, why don't you share with us what are some of the mistakes you think you learned when learning German or other languages? And then, how did you learn from those so you got better and better at learning languages?
I would identify maybe two mistakes. The first one is being a perfectionist, so expecting to be fluent in every language that you speak. And I think this is something that a lot of your students will, and a lot of your viewers will identify with. So I for a really long time took it personally when I made mistakes. Shied away from speaking because I knew that my language was not at a good enough level. And with time, I just discovered that that was just hindering my progress. So that was number one. Mistake number two was that for a few languages, my approach was too academic at times. So I would be doing grammar, I would try to visualize, to memorize vocabulary, but I wasn't making it fun. I wasn't finding a context in which to speak the language. I wasn't turning it into a game, if you will, making it playful, and that just made it more tedious. So yeah, we'll talk about tips later on, but I guess a couple of tips will come from that.
Yeah, so being a perfectionist and maybe a little more to of an academic or structured approach that was probably boring or not that interesting. I know I personally made those mistakes when I was learning French as a second language, and they hindered me as well. So now, when you're speaking all 7 languages and other languages, and let's say you make a mistake, well, what do you do now? How have you changed your approach from perfectionism? What do you do?
I think that over the years, I've, for lack of a better expression, learned to split my personality based on the language that I speak. So it's almost like a role play. So if I speak French, I'm one Milos, like one version of Milos. When I'm speaking Spanish, I'm a different version of Milos with a different sort of cultural background through which I learned Spanish. And then when I'm speaking Russian, it's a third version of Milos. And so I guess that has kind of helped me just think a little bit less personally about those mistakes. So when I make mistakes, it's that version of Milos that's making them, and it's not the real Milos. So this kind of role playing, it sounds a bit silly, but it actually helped me quite a lot. Separate the notion of making mistakes from my cherished identity.
I've heard polyglots talk about that before, and that makes sense because a lot of my students will relate to this. The mistakes you're comparing how you would speak in your own native language. So if you have this separate identity, then that separate identity, you don't have that same comparison. Is that what's helpful about that process?
Yeah, yeah. For some reason, we humans, we're really touchy about things that we feel define us, that they're a part of our identity. And if you kind of separate that language speaking identity into almost like a different character, like something you're playing on a stage, maybe sounds silly, but it's really helped. It's really works for me to also separate the guilt that comes sometimes with making mistakes.
Yeah, it's such an interesting approach. And hey, if it works, it works. So thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that. And oh, before we go on, I do want to thank my student and your student Hiroshi, who introduced us and suggested we have this interview. So Hiroshi, if you're watching, thank you so much for connecting us and making this possible. Now, we talked about the mistakes you made. So let's talk about some of your successes, or what would you feel are the qualities that you have or that successful language learners in general have that make learning the language easier?
They find the context and they find an objective. So in my case, I've been kind of blessed to be able to speak 5 or 6 languages on a daily basis because that's just the people in my company. They speak them. But looking back, my best periods of language learning really happened when I had a context through which to learn a language. So if I had a girlfriend that spoke the language, or maybe flatmates, or I was working at a company where the language was spoken. And I think that is by far the best way to be learning a language. So having a context where you don't actually have to make an effort, and you're kind of confronted with the language whether you like it or not. And then the second thing is an objective. So let's say I learned Russian to a reasonable intermediate degree before meeting my wife, who is Russian speaking, and then I uh, put it to myself as an objective to make my Russian really perfect, so that I could speak with my in-laws, with her parents, in a in an unconstrained sort of free flowing way. And that was a fantastic source of motivation. So different people will find different sources of motivation, either whether it's relationships or sports or business, but it's really important to have an objective.
Those are two great points. So, the context and the objective. And a lot of people, other people have popularized the idea of find your why, find your why. Why are you becoming fluent in English? Why is that important for you? So, thank you for sharing that. But let's talk about the context, because this is a struggle for many of my students watching. Is they know their why. They need to find a job, or they want to get a promotion, or they want to move abroad, but currently they don't work in English. They don't live in an English environment. They don't have friends or romantic partners who speak English. So they unfortunately don't have the context. Is there something that these students can do to create more of that environment or context when they are more isolated in a non-English speaking environment?
Absolutely. And there are two layers to that. First of all, the passive layer of just being exposed to the language. You talk a lot about that on your channel, and you give some great tips. And I think this is something that people anywhere on Earth can do. So listening to music, watching films, just letting English come in through their ears. The more difficult part, but still not insurmountable, is getting to speak. So getting to produce stuff in English. There are many language exchange websites. That would be my piece of advice if you really live in a place where nobody speaks English, and there's no chance to work in English, and you cannot travel that much internationally. Language exchange websites work really well. Or maybe you find a pen pal with whom you communicate in writing. These are relatively low cost, low hassle ways of getting to speak language if you want to on a daily basis.
Perfect. So, for everyone watching, you can still practice English. You can still become fluent even if you don't have that context. Just absorb yourself in the language and use the resources like the exchange websites or a pen pal. Those are wonderful tips. Now, you posted an article on Medium, which I'll link to in the description as well. Everyone, it's a
Thank you.
wonderful article on Milos's experience learning a language very quickly. And in that article, you mentioned that you rarely learn from formal study. Now, you talked about this previously about one of your biggest mistakes was making it more academic. But can you just talk about this a little bit more? What do you consider formal study, and why do you rarely use formal study?
I rarely do it because it is very difficult to keep up the motivation. So even for somebody like me, for who likes learning languages and for whom languages are part of my identity, it is very difficult to keep it academic, and to every day go through lessons in a in a book, or go through your flashcards and just keep doing that month in month out. It is just not practically feasible, at least for somebody like me. And what I mean by formal studies, that so it's doing grammar exercises, trying to memorize vocabulary. It's going through a book that's obviously not specifically designed for you. It's there for everybody. So I think I talk about an example in the article where I started working with a Hungarian teacher, a lovely lady who had worked with many people and had success, but she was going through this book lesson by lesson, and the lessons were not that useful for my language study because I needed to learn the Hungarian to be able to speak to a consul at the embassy, whereas lessons were about fish soup and words like that. So so yeah, that there are definite downsides to formal study.
I can relate to that. I remember in one of my first Spanish classes, the teacher was reviewing names of animals, but things like a hedgehog, a horse, a donkey. When am I ever going to use these words as
Yeah.
speaking Spanish as a second language? Like, it wasn't relevant to me, it wasn't interesting to me, and I quickly became very bored and lost motivation and didn't want to take those classes anymore at all. So I can definitely relate to that. But on the other hand, of course, we do need to learn the structure, vocabulary, grammar, and these formal rules of a language. That is important. So, how do you personally approach balancing formal study? Well, not formal, but the technical language. So, getting the input of the language and then getting output from the language. So, speaking the language. How do you balance those two areas of language learning?
So if we talk about the best way to approach learning a language, well, we talked about having an objective, we talked about having a context, and the next maybe layer of importance is having a good teacher. And so having a good teacher like yourself obviously makes a huge difference, not only for motivation but also a teacher needs to be able to recognize the speed with which the student is able to learn and then challenge them to learn at that speed. And on the student side, what makes a student really capable of learning, even if it's their first foreign language, it's if they're really fluent, and this is going to sound paradoxical, but if they're really fluent in their own language. Being fluent in your own language means that you know its grammar, you know its engine, you know how tenses are built, you know what an imperative is, and so on and so on. And if you really understand the mechanics of a language, and grammar is kind of the heart of that, then you can just take that and apply it to any other language without any issues, because the teacher can just tell you, well, do this exact same thing with these small changes, and you're good. And I think actually becoming a polyglot, so when you have your five languages, adding a sixth, the biggest added value from the first five languages is that you have the experience with all those different types of grammar or little intricacies of grammar that you can then just bring up to your brain and just deploy on the additional language. But if it's your first foreign language, then yeah, knowing your native language, knowing how grammar works, and having a great teacher that can lead you at the speed at which you can travel, that's super important.
Yeah, great tips. And that makes sense for sure. I think of if you're learning a sport, maybe you're learning to play tennis and you understand how a racket sport works. And then if you learn another racket sport,
Yeah.
then it's a lot easier because you already know that one racket sport. So it becomes
Absolutely.
easier and easier. But that's true. And a lot of us, we don't know the structure of our own language until you become a language learner or teacher, and then you understand it.
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
and I remember from your Medium article, you also talked about how you would practice speaking for at least 1 hour per day, if I'm remembering correctly. So, how did you do that practice? Was it with a partner? Was it alone, a teacher, ChatGPT? What are the different ways that you would use to practice speaking?
Sometimes with a teacher, sometimes just with a conversation partner, because the pressure is a little bit lower. You don't feel like your every mistake is being perceived. You know, because sometimes you also need to release the pressure a little bit and relax. So yeah, definitely speaking, whatever context I could find. But also, there's another thing that I think over email we talked about, which was thinking to myself, quote unquote, in the language, and that's maybe one thing that not a lot of people do, and it's interesting. But I would spend a few minutes per day trying to think in the language by giving myself scenarios again, like role playing scenarios. So maybe I would imagine that I was giving a presentation in the language, in this case Hungarian, on any topic, and then I would think about how I would be delivering that presentation to an audience, and I would be doing this while riding my motorcycle or being, just walking or going to pick up my children at the kindergarten. It sounds a bit funny, but actually, in my experience, it is almost the same as actually speaking. So as actually delivering the presentation, and I think it has parallels to, you used racket sports as an example. So Novak Djokovic, the famous tennis player who is also Serbian, he talks a lot about visualization. So visualizing what's going to happen during the match, good or bad, before you actually do it. And he says that the act of visualizing actually prepares him. And I think when it comes to language learning, that sort of visualization of verbal production is almost the same as the real thing, at least for me.
Yeah, that's an excellent tip. And for sure, we hear this about athletes doing this a lot, this visualization, seeing themselves jump over the pole or whatever it might be to help them prepare. But we can all do this. And I prepared for our conversation now. I reviewed, oh, what I'm going to ask you and just went through it in my head this morning as I was getting ready. And it helped me as a native speaker feel more prepared and confident for this exact conversation we're having now.
Yeah, and it shows. And there are so many benefits. You become more relaxed, you're more at ease, your breathing becomes deeper. Yeah, preparation is super important.
Absolutely. So, everyone, you can prepare on your own for all conversations that you may have. Now, on the topic of speaking, this is definitely the most common frustration I have with my students. They say with their language, okay, I can conjugate verb tenses, I know the grammar rules, I know the definitions to words, I can write, I can read, but I just can't speak. When I open my mouth, I forget my words or it just doesn't come out. Do you have any advice? Is that something you personally experienced as a language learner, or what advice could you share?
My first piece of advice would be to relax. So, of course, it's going to happen, and not only with language learning or speaking a language that you don't speak so well, but also speaking your own language. So, you and I speak English, and all of a sudden, somebody asks us to give a presentation in front of 5,000 people. We are starting to forget our words and become anxious, and so on. So, it's something that happens to everybody. The second thing would be, you already speak the language. So it's just a matter of level, fluency, number of errors, and so on. So it's a continuum. So there's no switch that happens between I cannot speak the language, I'm not confident, and I can speak the language and I can deliver a physiology presentation. So it's a continuum, and it's important to find quick, not quick wins, but wins along the way. So if you are just starting to learn the language, so maybe understanding a 3-minute episode of something on YouTube would be great. And then maybe later on, having a phone call in the language, maybe the next step, and so on and so on and so on. So having these milestones, I think, really helps, because that way you convince yourself also that you are progressing, irrespective of how it might look at certain times.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I like that because it's just a small step, and then keep going. And all of a sudden, you're speaking. But again,
Yeah,
just relax. And it's not that big of a deal either way. That's great
yeah. Everyone
advice.
has to learn. Yeah.
So, if my students were to do one thing this week to improve their fluency, what would you recommend they do?
Definitely find the context for their English learning. So when you have a context, whether it's a pen pal, whether it's a conversation partner, whether it's some shows you watch, and so on, everything just becomes so much easier. It becomes a game as opposed to an obligation. So finding the context for their English learning, super important.
All right, everyone, you have your work this week. Find your context. Now, Milosh, I'll share the Medium article you wrote in the description. Are there any other resources you would like to mention, or any other ways that my students can connect with you?
Well, Jennifer, we discussed before coming on air that this is not exactly what I do. I'm just a polyglot amongst other things, but I'm always happy to answer people's queries and questions to the extent to which I can. So maybe Medium would be a good way to contact me. So do read that article, and then if you have any additional questions, reach out. And I get a lot of reactions to that article, but I try to respond to most of them, and try and give guidance if I can.
Well, absolutely. And again, because this isn't what you do professionally, you're not a professional language teacher. You just are a polyglot who uses these languages in your day-to-day life. I appreciate you so much coming on here and sharing this advice so generously with my students. And absolutely everyone, read the Medium article. I loved it, and I know you will too. So thank you again so much for being here, Milosh. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, Jennifer, really.